You're listening to What's Going On.
I'm Frank Hoeber, and the title of my book is Against Time, Letters from Nazi Germany, 1938 to 1939. When I see the news today of American politicians proposing to exclude refugees from the horrors that are going on in Syria and say that those refugees are a potential danger to the United States, it is exactly the kind of rhetoric that was going on in the media and among politicians in America in the 1930s.
I'm Loraine Ballard Morrill. Johannes Hoeber left Nazi Germany for America in 1938. His wife, Elfriede, and their 9-year-old daughter, Suzanne, were unable to leave until September of the following year after the outbreak of World War II. 50 years later, Johannes and Elfriede's son found an old folder containing long letters they exchanged during the many months they were separated. And this has become a book called Against Time, Letters from Nazi Germany. Joining us is its author, Francis Hoeber, and I want to thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Well, let's talk about the letters. So the letters document this long separation between the family. First of all, what was it like to discover the letters, and what was inside the letters?
It was extraordinary to discover them. It was difficult because they were all in German, and at the time I spoke only a limited amount of German because my parents, although they came from Germany, they became Americans and spoke very little German at home. So I had to go and study German in order to be able to make out the letters completely. What was amazing was here were two 35-year-olds who had been married for 10 years and who were separated suddenly and who had to exchange by mail their feelings. They had to argue. They had to report to one another what was going on. They had to share their anxieties both over economic issues about making a living. They had to share issues of concern about what was going on in Germany. They had to share concerns about their daughter, who was 8 years old at the time. And above all, they had to share their concerns about how my mother, Elfriede, was going to get out of Germany and into the United States.
Tell us what was going on at the time that these letters were written.
The Nazis had been in power at that time for 5 years. And over those years, the pressure on the citizens had become harder and harder. Movements were restricted. They were constantly being observed. They were constantly afraid of attacks from the Gestapo and from the police. Every neighbor was potentially a police spy. And so there was no sense of security or comfort. At the same time, the family managed to, my mother's mother was living there and her brothers were living in this in the city of Düsseldorf in Germany, and the family held together to work together to find comfort themselves under this dictatorship in which they lived.
So what were some of the things that they were experiencing? What was going on around them? You talk about the fear of the Gestapo and the Nazis. But what were some of the specific things that were going on that were very worrisome to the husband in this couple?
The most dramatic event was on the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, which is known to historians as Kristallnacht, when the Nazis organized the systematic destruction of Jewish businesses and homes all over Germany. 100,000 people were made homeless that night. Tens of thousands of Jewish businesses were destroyed. My parents were not Jewish, but they had many Jewish friends. But quite aside from that, they were decent human beings who were horrified at what was going on to their friends and neighbors. My parents that night rescued the child of a neighbor where the husband was arrested by the Nazis and the woman was injured and had to go to the hospital. And they kept that child safe for several days until the parents were able to return. That was the most vicious single event to which they were witness. And it was shortly after that that my father felt it wise to leave Germany. He had previously, several years earlier, been arrested and imprisoned for 5 weeks by the Nazis because of his liberal social democratic views and his activities on behalf of an organization favoring the preservation of democracy in Germany. Meantime, while my mother was sitting through these very nerve-wracking circumstances in Germany, my father had come here to Philadelphia, and very quickly his first task was to find a job. And he worked very hard at that. In his first week here, he sent out 15 resumes and had several job interviews in less than 7 days after his boat landed. And within a month, he had secured a job, first non-paying, then eventually paying, working on Philadelphia reform politics in an early movement already then, early in 1939. So for him, it was very exciting. Everything was new. There was anxiety over how much money he would be able to make and how he would support his wife and daughter when they eventually got here. But it was also very exciting to see how welcoming people were to him. That's part of the paradox. My mother was stranded in Germany largely because she could not get permission for herself and for my sister to enter the United States. And the laws at that time were very restrictive and made it very, very difficult for Germans to get permission to come into the United States. My father had been lucky and had gotten in early, and the people he met here were most welcoming, most supportive, most anxious to help in any way they could. So that you had the government that was being restrictive, but American individuals who were being very welcoming and very open to any idea of foreigners, and particularly refugees from Nazi Germany, coming in and finding a safe haven here in the United States.
Let's depart a little bit from the story of Against Time and talk about the relevance of that story to what's going on now, because you talk about the contradictions of this country. And the one hand, individually, Americans being very welcoming to Johannes Hoeber, but on the other hand, being very restrictive on the ability of his family to come in because of the policy of the country. Well, similar things are happening now, aren't they?
When I see the news today of American politicians proposing to exclude refugees from the horrors that are going on in Syria and say that those refugees are a potential danger to the United States, it is exactly the kind of rhetoric that was going on in the media and among politicians in America in the 1930s, when the political system set up increasing barriers to refugees from Germany getting into the United States. The language being used today and the language being used 75 years ago is, to my mind, equally shameful. To give you an example, in 1939, there were 325,000 Germans who were trying to get into the United States, and fewer than 25,000 were admitted. What that meant is that only one person out of 12 who wanted to get here was able to. But we know now, with the hindsight of history, that the 300,000 people who were denied permission to come into the United States almost all died as a result of the Holocaust, as a result of the war, as a result of all the tragedies that they were able to foresee then. And that exclusion of those people at that time was a stain on American history, and we are facing similar problems and questions today. And the same arguments were made. Oh, there may be a dangerous person among all those who are seeking to come in. We shouldn't take the risk of having someone come into the country who might be dangerous to Americans. That you're hearing the same things said today, and yet we know now that we had a moral obligation to save people who could be saved. The fact that my parents were among the very fortunate ones doesn't change the fact that there were so many who were so much less fortunate than they.
Tell us how the family was able to be reunited in the end.
In order to get permission to enter the United States at that time, there was a requirement in the law that you would not become what was called a public charge. What that means is the government should never have to support you. In order to meet that requirement, people had to prove that they had a way of supporting themselves. And when my mother and sister originally applied, they were turned down because they were unable to demonstrate that they had someone who would support them if they got here. My father, who was already here, told a friend who he had known for only a few weeks what had happened. And the next day, that man came in to the office where he was working with my father and told my father that he and his wife would put up a pledge of everything they owned to support my mother and sister if they came into the United States. And he did that. And that was without being asked, only out of pure decency and humanity. And there was another person, a distant relative with whom my father eventually got in contact. This person, too, said, if there's somebody who needs to come in, I will put up everything I have as security for this person, for your wife and daughter to be supported if they come here to the United States. And they filled out the documents and they provided the affidavits so that, as difficult as it was to get in, individual Americans, even without being asked, pledged their support to allow people to come in and were open in a way that allowed my family to survive.
That is an amazing story. And again, a great illustration of the contradictions of this country, of the individual generosity and decency of Americans and the harshness of some of our policies. The book must have been an amazing journey for you to be able to read the letters, to translate them, and to have come to life the history of your family through these letters.
You know your parents a certain way when you're growing up as a kid, but you don't know what they're really like as adults between themselves. And this is a very personal correspondence between two adults who I got to know as completely new and different people through their letters in a way I had never known or understood them as a child.
Francis Hoeber, thank you so much for joining us. The book is called Against Time, Letters from Nazi Germany, 1938 to 1939, an object lesson not only about the tremendous journey of this family from Nazi Germany to this country, but also about the challenges and contradictions of the immigrant story that continues to unfold even now in this country. I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm Loraine Ballard Morrill.